Good afternoon or good morning, everyone. Welcome. We are having a session of the Philosophy, Disability, and Social Change Conference, the third iteration, and I'm very glad to see you here or to engage with you here. My name is Melinda Hall. I'm Associate Professor and Chair of Philosophy at Stetson University in DeLand, Florida, and I'll be chairing and moderating this session. Please note that you have auto captions available under the CC button at the bottom of the screen that you can interact with. And please also note that there are different ways of interacting here. Engage with the Q&A button during the session after the presentation. So I am a white woman with shoulder length brown hair. I'm wearing a bright colored shirt to be present on Zoom, yellow, and I do a lot of work on philosophy of disability, and I'm so excited about all of the presentations. So I'm excited to introduce Catherine Clune Taylor. Catherine Clune Taylor uses the pronoun she, her, and she is an assistant professor in the program in Gender and Sexuality Studies at Princeton University. A feminist science and technology studies scholar, Clune Taylor received a PhD in philosophy from the University of Alberta and works at the intersections of philosophy of science, philosophy of sex, gender and sexuality, critical disability studies, and bioethics. She has published articles in Hypatia, the American Journal of Public Health, and is the author of the chapter, Is Sex Socially Constructed?, in the Routledge Handbook on Feminist Philosophy of Science, which was published in 2020. She is currently at work on a book manuscript entitled Securing White Cis Futures on the Government of Sex/Gender in the 21st Century. The title of her presentation today is Non-White Cis Life and the Eugenic Present. So I will turn it over to Catherine.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so thrilled to be here. So first, a little about me. I am a mixed race, Black, light-skinned woman or cisgender woman. I am a plus size person and I have Black and gray hair, and I'm here today on Zoom in a maroon top. And yeah, I am so thrilled to be here and once again be part of this wonderful conference. And I'll just share my slides here. So do let me know if anyone has any issues with them. So I'm just going to jump into it. And I wanted to actually note, one of the funny things was for me, actually, when I was preparing this, was I looked at this title and I thought, wow, this is such a me title, but also I could be talking about so many things today. I could very easily be talking about our current context, that is the post-pandemic or endemic pandemic context, in which many disabled and chronically ill folks are kind of being sacrificed for a return to normal. And I have been actually writing and thinking substantially about this current time and what does feminist politics require of us in this current like post-pandemic period. But actually today I'm going to be talking about something a little bit different. So just move my slide here. Thank you. So today I'm actually going to be using this wonderful time with you here to be in community with all of you folks to think a little bit and show you a bit of a snapshot from my upcoming book project. I am currently in the process of finishing up the manuscript, and I am starting to kind of bring these arguments out into the world. And so I'm really looking forward to hearing your feedback today. And so my book, Securing White Cis Futures on the Government of Sex/Gender in the 21st Century, is a book that's going to be taking a feminist Foucauldian approach to thinking about the management of sex and gender, and particularly those who are kind of constituted as quote unquote abnormal with regards to sex and gender. And so I'm thinking here specifically about trans and intersex folks. And I think a lot of us who have been watching the news or been surveying the kind of contemporary moment can see quite visibly the ways in which trans life is being attacked and is under frequent attack, sometimes violent attack. And so I want to kind of start there and thinking about what does that contemporary landscape also look like for intersex kids and intersex folks. I do think sometimes that part of the conversation, at least within the contemporary moment, can get lost. Then I'm going to move on to think a little bit about what my intellectual commitments are in this project and frame how I am engaging this work. What are my starting places here? I'm then going to move on to start showing you a little bit of a snapshot of the arguments themselves in the book. And so one of the things I'm doing here is thinking about the emergence of white cis life as a kind of normalized form of life. And so this is a expansion of and real kind of rearticulation of previous accounts that I have published specifically under the term cisgendered futures, by which I refer to a normalized trajectory of development over the lifespan in which a variety of different sex and gender variables are required to be maintained in dynamic or coherent alignment. And so I am now updating or re-articulating that history with regards to a few different scholars and some very important work that's come out in the past few years, thinking specifically about how do we situate that history with regards to the history of scientific racism, or how might we think actually that about kind of the famous history to many of us about the emergence of gender, the kind of constitution of the heterosexual matrix, the constitution of cis life as normal within the context of intersex management in John Money's clinic. How might we think about all of that as a kind of function of racial difference? I'll then move on to talk about or think about how do we enter the year 2000, right? So I will discuss more recent history in thinking about the management or the biomedical discourse and thinking about non-cis life, specifically with regards to trans and intersex life. And then I'm going to come back and think about or return to thinking about the anti-trans bills that I started talking about at the beginning, and how we might think about what is currently being called anti-woke culture as a kind of response to our crisis of white cis life itself. So let's move forward. So just thinking about surveying the contemporary landscape for trans and intersex kids, I think, as I said, I think most of us are very aware of and familiar with the kind of quote unquote hysterical proliferation of anti-trans bills, particularly targeting children within the last few years, and as well as an increasing amount of violence targeting the LGBTQ plus community more generally. And I use the term hysterical here, which I recognize is a very loaded and problematic term, but I use it here in quotation marks for a very specific reason. And that is, I want to highlight the hyperbolic nature of these responses, right? The fact is that there are more bills barring out trans kids from taking part in school sports activities than there are actually out trans kids in sports in schools. And so I want to kind of highlight the fact that this threat, right, this concern or this figure of the kind of trans child or the kind of contagiousness of queerness is receiving a response that is quite disproportional in a variety of ways. And I think highlighting that is actually quite important. And so what's been going on, and in some ways I actually initially was going to talk about in some detail about recent events and about, for example, the recent guidance that was issued by the US government about domestic terrorism targeting LGBTQ plus people. I would prefer, actually, I've decided I don't want to go into detail about that. I am kind of tired of giving space to those folks at the moment. But all this is to say, I think if you're keeping up on the news, you know how intense this threat is getting, right? That it is in really kind of heating up in some ways. And so I think we're all very aware of the increasing efforts to eliminate trans life, right? And eliminate trans futures, or eliminate kind of queer futures more generally. But there hasn't been, I think, as much consideration, or at least there isn't really kind of public discourse about what is going on with regards to intersex medicine right now, or the management of intersex conditions in children, unless someone is, for example, interested in that field. And so just for folks who are not aware, right now, the landscape in intersex management is that surgical assignment of sex slash gender to infants remains kind of the de facto treatment model, right? Surgical assignment is continuing. I should say that it is very difficult to get very clear data with regards to intersex surgeries, particularly in the US, because of the kind of fractured institutional and insurance landscape. However, if anyone is interested, I'd be happy to discuss data that's coming out from the NHS in particular that looks at kind of the rate of surgical assignment. So, but we can say, generally speaking, this remains, or surgical assignment in infancy remains, the standard of care. However, consensus about surgery is starting to dissipate among not only among clinical experts in the field. And I would point to a few things here. So one of the things that we have seen is we're starting to see certain groups or certain institutions that have instituted bans on surgery in response to lobbying and activism. However, these bans are themselves a little bit piecemeal, often make exceptions for certain conditions, and so are not quite the strong position in favor of autonomy, even if we want to acknowledge, like, we might have concerns or questions about liberal accounts of autonomy. It isn't that turn towards autonomy that we might think or hope by seeing these kind of institutions of these bans from the outside. But there is increasingly a lot of debate within the clinical literature. So, and I actually do think this is quite interesting. I have a whole section in the book where I talk about this in some detail. I would be happy to discuss it in the Q&A, but we're seeing a lot of, just quickly, we're seeing a lot of more publications where, for example, we're seeing the publication of original research, original data, and then it will be followed by a series of commentaries and responses from the authors. And they're debating now things like, what is the value or quality of the data that's being introduced here, and what can we conclude on the basis of this data about the morality of surgical assignment. Again, happy to talk about that in the Q&A if folks would like more information. And then the last thing I would note here is that the activist landscape in terms of intersex activism remains somewhat fractured as well. The things I would note here is that we have a range of both parent and patient-run organizations with a variety of different positions on surgical assignment. One thing that is very important to note is that the only patient-run or kind of adult intersex folk-run organization, which is Interact, is specifically and quite firmly against surgical assignment. However, among parent-run organizations, there is a wide range of positions, and some of those groups do have quite a bit of lobbying power. And so there is still, there's kind of a fracture in terms of, or I would say, there is less consensus among stakeholders with regards to intersex surgery than there has been, say, even 10 years ago. But we still haven't really dislodged this medical practice, right? That surgery still remains the go-to form of care. And so one of my questions here is, how do we understand this current moment, right? Like, how do we make sense of what's happening in terms of the increased emphasis and focus and as I say, kind of near hysterical attack on trans children in particular? And how do we understand as well what's going on with regards to intersex conditions and debates around that? And moving on to kind of think through how I think we should approach these questions. So first and foremost, I think in order to engage with or survey this field or do a good analytic of it, or provide a good analytic of it, we need to engage with or start from a Foucauldian account of governmentality as the quote unquote conduct of contact, as it's often kind of summarized, or as thinking about this as the ways in which an ensemble of discourses, institutions, practices, and various other non-discursive elements function together to constrain the available field of action for individuals in terms of the kind of choices for their own lives that they might make. And for those who, for example, might be here today doing critical disability studies, who are familiar with Shelley Tremaine's work, I think this kind of framework is very familiar to us. Further, I think we need to start from a commitment to critical disability studies. One of the ways that I flag that commitment in my work is by the use of the term body minds. And this is gesturing towards folks like Dr. Tremaine or Sammy Schock's work in terms of emphasizing the rejection of mind-body dualism that underwrites so much ableism, and is, I think, a clear kind of tenet of critical disability studies. But further, in terms of thinking about or engaging with or approaching all these issues from a position that understands impairment to be just as socially constructed as disability in itself. So I'm interested as well here in the ways that impairment is being constituted or being thought through. And I'm also using here sex/gender as a combined term, and this is for a few reasons. One of them is I want to note that there is now an increasing amount of debate among clinical experts in the field as to what they are actually doing with surgery, right? That there are debates about whether we should call genital normalizing surgeries for intersex folks the assignment of sex or the assignment of gender. Which I think is quite an interesting point, and again, one I'm willing to talk more about in the Q&A if folks are interested. But also pointing towards a kind of tradition of feminist STS scholars who are thinking about and noting the ways in which sex and gender depend referentially on each other such that they can't really come apart, right? So this is a gesture in one sense to Judith Butler's arguments with regards to sex being gender all along and looking specifically at the context of intersex care in order to make that claim, but also acknowledging just generally that these objects, while they might come apart, and this is why I maintain the slash between them, as opposed to, for example, putting them together as sex, gender in a kind of hair-away nature culture sense, that they do come apart, but they always travel together, that they can't really be drawn apart in the way that we might want. And so these are kind of the givens that I'm starting with, the place that I'm beginning from. And so what I want to do in this project, or what I'm interested in here, is how the ensemble of discourses, practices, and institutions, etc., functions to govern sex and gender in the 21st century, or as we've moved into the year 2000. And in particular, I'm interested in the dynamic entanglement between biomedical knowledge power, so biomedical knowledge production, but also practices and their relation, and more popular discourses and practices relevant to the management of sex gender. And so some particular aspects of this, which I attend to in some detail in the research, include thinking about the content of these discourses. That is, how do we understand the relationship of sex and gender, and what the discussions about kind of like the natural versus the socially constructed here, but also how these this knowledge, these practices function, as well as the rules of knowledge production and or legitimate argumentation that are being formed here. So what do we think counts as a legitimate argument against surgical assignment for intersex folks or intersex infants? Do we think that we can use moral arguments alone, or do we need data? And how do we understand the kind of epistemic and ethical configuration of this field? And so for today, however, sorry, and so as a Foucauldian, though, I take the insight that in order to kind of think about the present, we need to look at the past, and we need to understand the kind of history out of which these contemporary practices and discourses emerge. And that's why I turn first here to rethink this constitution of white cis life itself. And so, as I said, this is re-articulating or expanding quite substantially upon the work that I've published before, thinking about cisgendered life and cisgendered futures as these abstract trajectories of development across the lifespan that people are being forced into. And so arguing, as I have in the past, that efforts like conversion therapies with children, or efforts like surgically assigning sex to intersex infants, are attempts to secure cisgendered futures for intersex folks or for children unable to provide informed consent. And that this includes not merely identity, although that is part of it, but concerns things as well, like primary sex characteristics, secondary sex characteristics, down to minutia, right, in terms of, for example, whether or not one has male or female typical fat distribution or hair growth patterns, etc. And so I'm updating this story with regards to work that has been come out in the last few years that is trying to resituate that history with regards to a larger history of scientific racism, and think about this as part of, and in fact, a function of the constitution of racial difference. And so some of the folks who I'm thinking with here are C. Riley Snorton's work in Black on Both Sides, A History of Trans Identity, in which, a racial history of trans identity, in which, for example, Snorton discusses or resituates these techniques, and specifically these kind of technologies of power and their associated knowledges that allow for their facilitate and justify their use, with the emergence of gynecology in the plantation, with the work of J. Marion Sims on anesthetized slaves, and the way in which Black bodies are being used as matter here for the refinement and production of techniques in order to preserve and create white femininity, or normative heteroreproductive white women's bodies, right? I'm also thinking here with Kyla Schuler's work in the Biopolitics of Feeling, Race, Sex, and Science in the 19th century. And this is a place where Schuler is looking very kind of specifically at thinking about the emergence of sex and gender difference as a function of racial difference. And again, happy to talk about this more in the Q&A. I realize I'm kind of just hitting the big hits here, but I wanted to give more of a schematic overview of some of the work that I'm doing here. And the last person I'm thinking with here who's been really just so fruitful for me is Jules Gill Peterson and her work in Histories of the Transgender Child. And one of the very important things that Jules is doing in this book is returning to the clinic at Johns Hopkins and thinking about the way in which, in that context of the, right, co-committed with this kind of time that we often talk about within feminist histories of gender or of cisgender life, thinking about the racial politics of what was going on at Hopkins. And so one of her key arguments is that gender emerges as a kind of capacity for change, as a kind of form of racialized plasticity, right? That there's this notion that white people or white bodies can be more easily or better normalized within kind of heteronormative gender roles or heterosexism. And that if we continue to just simply kind of turn to these or understand the way in which these technologies of the self and technologies of domination are working through a kind, are performing racialization, I should say. And so this allows me to really redevelop or refine my own account, such that I start to think about white cis life then as a racialized, always already racialized, and normalized an abstract trajectory of development across the lifespan, in which these always already racialized sex, gender, and sexual characteristics, and among others, remain in dynamic but coherent alignment. And the and others there's quite a lot going on there. I just wanted to flag that because I'm not going to be able to talk about it here. But for example, I do think that an essential part to this, particularly in the US context, is to think about this in terms of class mobility, that a normal white life is one that is capable of class mobility. But there are a few things I want to highlight about this account. So one of them is that it involves disparately racialized temporal logics. So thinking with Gil Peterson, thinking about racialized gender plasticity as whiteness, we can see the way in which this cashes out differently for people of different races. So for example, we think frequently about people of color or BIPOC kids as being more mature for their age than they are. We can think about how they are frequently assessed as being older than they actually are. Whereas white folks, and for example, we can think about discourses around school shooters, that white men or white boys are often positioned as boys, right, as immature. Or even thinking, who do we think can be rehabilitated and who can't? Who is always already kind of abnormal in a way that is just beyond normalization. Further, there's this notion of differential vulnerability, right? That certain folks are more vulnerable to being caught up by these kind of like contagious forms of degeneracy than others, so they need to be protected. Further, I think that this account is deeply interactionist. So counterclaims of essentialism that are given by, for example, those folks who want to argue that there is only binary sex and gender are the same. Right, actually what we see is this understanding of white cis life is actually a deeply interactionist account. Insofar as, for example, my kid can't be exposed to someone who might say the word gay because it might make them gay. Or if they see a drag queen and go to a drag story time, it is a kind of grooming, right? Like there's a clear account of the way that the environment could change the individual. And so this counters kind of traditional claims of essentialism here, but it also is a complicated counter argument against feminist new materialist hopes regarding kind of the liberatory nature of complex and deeply interactionist forms of causation in itself or in themselves. This is also, I would argue, this form of white cis life is an ideal, abstract, and kind of transcendental form. It's an optimum, it's a goal. I don't think it's a norm in the Foucauldian sense, but I'm happy to kind of talk about why that might be the case. So I see this about striving towards an optimal form of life. It's not about individual particular lives. And I actually think this kind of account of thinking about life itself, or this form or optimal form of life itself, as ideal, as transcendent, as not necessarily connected to individual bodies, can help us make sense of a variety of things I'm referring to these days as biopolitical paradoxes. So things that seem internally contradictory, right? We can think about the pro-life movement as one that sees itself in favor of life, but results practically in a variety of deaths. And here, I think we can make sense of this in terms of a Foucauldian account of making live or letting die. But I often think this is actually about we don't really care about the loss of individual lives on the way to achieving this kind of more transcendent form of life, this goal, this ideal, that we might even identify as a similar one that is being held by the Nazis, for example. And so moving forward with this account, I think that, if we think that this is what happens, or like we're reframing what happens within intersex medicine and the introduction of the optimal gender rearing treatment model as kind of the codification of this notion of white cis life, and a particularly medical codification of it, we can then jump ahead, and that is our historical past, to think about what happens, or what is our position when we move into the year 2000. And I argue that, entering the year 2000, both intersex and trans medicine have been facing increasingly heated depathologization movements, but they take very different responses to it. So the folks at intersex medicine they kind of doubled down on pathology with the Disorders of Sex Development Treatment Model in 2006. Whereas trans medicine actually pulls back from pathologization via the rearticulation of gender identity disorders, gender dysphoria. And this brings about a kind of winnowing of who is being pathologized here to only those who experience dysphoria such that they might seek out gender confirming intervention. Now, these are very different responses, and there are likely a variety of reasons for these differences, but I think the difference itself is noteworthy insofar as it reflects kind of contradictory accounts of whether or not we might think that non-cis life is pathological in itself in the absence of distress or social impairment, as trans medicine is saying they can't decide whether that's true. And intersex medicine is saying it's obviously true, right? It is obviously pathological. And so this difference is noteworthy. This is another argument I make in the book, that I argue there are a variety of reasons why this might be the case. But I do think in large part, or one part of this, or piece of this puzzle, has to do with the differing accounts of pathology that these fields are working with. And the way in which trans medicine has its own, or at least psychiatry has its own account of pathology defined in terms of distress and social impairment as a result of this history of the homosexuality diagnosis. Again, happy to talk about that in some detail. And so sorry, here, I just had a screen pop up. And I got myself a little lost. Yes, so, sorry, I went forward and I should have gone back. Okay. And so how do we, I think this is part of how we get here. And so then if we think about the present moment, I want to focus here specifically in terms of thinking about trans life for my last few slides, is that what happens is, at least the kind of, in a way, because the folks in trans medicine kind of pull back on pathology, there is a sense in which the kind of forces or attempts to normalize or eliminate trans life become extra medical, right? Like medicine is no longer playing that role in the same way. And so all of these forces that are aiming at kind of the elimination of trans life become extra medical. I think that's why we see the proliferation of like legal and more social, political, discursive, or extra medical interventions here that, as I argue, are quote unquote kind of hysterical in nature. They're disproportionate. And importantly here, I argue that queer life, if we read these kind of anti-trans bills or anti-trans interventions, they aim not merely at making like trans lives unlivable or invisible. They need to make them down like unintelligible, right? Like unsayable. We can't even say the singular they in the classroom, lest it bring into the room this possibility of a queer life. So the focus here is primarily on children rather than adults. And I, in my own work, speak of this in relation to thinking about the child as the figurative future. Further, support of trans kids is now vilified as sexualized or potentially as predatory forms of harm or negligence. And so I argue here that what we're actually seeing, what this kind of consolidation of efforts shows us, is that, again, counter to the kind of essentialism posited by many on the right, this is a very developmental and dynamically interactionist understanding of the kind of development of a sexed or gendered or sexual future. And it's one which renders white cis life itself as a fragile achievement, one that is reliant on white innocence, right? Like children must be protected from all of this information lest they are somehow sullied by it or rendered abnormal themselves. And so I have to say, this is my original slide. At the very end here, I wanted to argue about reading anti-trans bills and anti-woke culture as a crisis of white life itself. So what's happening here? And so this was my original slide. There is an image on it. If it's of a man who looks quite frantic, has a bunch of pieces of paper up on a board, and it has lines and arrows going between it, and it looks very kind of conspiracy theory-ish. And I will say, I've been trying very hard to kind of make sense of like what's going on here and how do we understand this crisis of white cis life itself, and tie that connection to like anti-woke culture and anti-trans bills as part of it. And I have been working on like how do I give an account of woke culture or anti-woke culture? Like, what does it mean? What does it entail? It's very difficult for me to kind of put together. And this is the part of the work and the talk that has often felt the most like incoherent. And this is why I've had the like conspiracy theorist dude to be like, I promise you, I think all of these things go together. Can I convince you that they do? And the horrible thing that has happened is that in the last week or so, because of a lawsuit that is being filed against Ron DeSantis and his attempts to ban critical race theory and ban discussions of like transsexuality or any discussions of sexual orientation in classrooms, he has introduced something called the anti-woke bill, and lawsuits against that have required his lawyers to very clearly articulate what woke culture is. And so my attempts at initially kind of deriving it was identifying it with like intersectionality and historicization, or kind of anti-capitalist leftist politics, or like acceptance of LGBTQ identities or support. And in the end, I guess, like, thanks, Ron DeSantis. This is a slide. It has a picture of a young girl on it who looks very skeptical and is giving the side eye. I guess, like, thank you, Ron DeSantis, for giving me this account. But now we have a clear and specific definition of what woke culture is. And it is, or at least as articulated by Ron DeSantis's lawyers, quote, the belief that there are systemic injustices in American society and the need to address them, which I think hopefully aligns actually quite well with what I first articulated as LGBTQ plus acceptance or support, intersectionality, historicization, and a kind of leftist politics. But I do argue that underwriting all of this, right, if we understand anti-trans bills as part of this anti-woke culture backlash, this is a crisis of white cis life itself. And it is a crisis of acknowledging the kind of racialized and gendered and sexualized history out of which the contemporary present emerges, and the notion that we might need to address or consider that in any way, right? And part of that, for white cis life to kind of remain this fragile achievement, we require naturally and unambiguously binary sex gender roles, right? It is essential to this maintenance. And so I think this demands the elimination of non-white cis life. And I think that is how we must be reading anti-trans bills at the contemporary moment. So I'll end there. Thank you so much for following me through this somewhat, at times it felt a little like pointing to here and here and here talk, but I'm very excited to hear your feedback. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was absolutely wonderful and so extremely interesting. I have several threads that I myself selfishly want to follow up on, but we have a question in the Q&A from Corinne. And I'll just read that out to you. She, of course, thanks you for this amazing talk. They do. And asks about your use of the notion of plasticity. They write, I find that there is an interesting tension between how Jill Peterson explores plasticity and connects it to how whiteness is framed as imbued with promise / possibility / futurity, versus how someone like Zakiya Jackson uses plasticity and connects it to Blackness and fungibility. The question is, I was wondering what, if any, connections to see between plasticity and fungibility.
Thank you so much, Corinne, for this question. You're hitting something that I have been thinking about quite a bit myself. And I will say first, I don't know that I can give an answer that I'm 100% behind yet, because I'm still doing some reading and still doing some research. And I think I'm very excited by the work that Zakiya Jackson is doing. And I do agree with her in many points. I actually don't know that I see it as a tension as so much of thinking about differential forms of plasticity. So the way in which racialization results in this kind of like disparate forms or disparate articulations or conceptualizations of plasticity for different folks. And that, you know, I've been thinking a lot about the way that we think about, you know, police shootings, or talking about, yeah, children, often like young men. So like, how do we talk about young men who are taken up by the carceral system of different races, and the way in which clearly plasticity is working different there, right? And so I don't know that I think it is so much about or attention, but about what we require as kind of a refinement of the logics, and particularly the temporal logics of plasticity, and that they're all working together there. But thank you.
Great. So Joe Wolf has a question, has his hand raised. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much. A really fascinating talk. And I love the definition of the anti-woke culture, because it feels like almost everyone, even people who are very conservative, would fall into that. So if you think hardworking people aren't paid enough, for example, that would be that would be an example. But so my question, I'm sort of stumbling around a bit here. So apologies if this doesn't come out quite right, but I'm very interested in the way essentialism is used in this debate, because I mean you could see it as being used on both sides of the argument, particularly around gender reassignment surgery, because you might think that if someone is born intersex, then the argument could be essentialist or anti-essentialist on both sides. So the reassignment argument would be there are only two sexes, so only two genders, so we're going to assign you to the correct one, your real one. Or say, well, no, society works in this particular way and we only accept two, so we're going to allocate you. So that would seem to be an anti-essentialist position. So you might think that there's an argument in which those who want to preserve intersexuality are essentialist in their way. And so I don't know. Anyway, I'll leave it there.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I will say that I do think it's a very interesting area, insofar as I do find that people can hold simultaneously very kind of internally contradictory positions about essentialism, or in terms of like, what do we think is natural here? So as a kind of aside, there's here at Princeton, there's a psychologist named Christina Olson. She works in the Human Variation Lab. And so she works a lot with physicians who are involved in gender confirming interventions for trans folks and trans kids. And they will sometimes, and one of the things she noted to me is that sometimes when they have patients who have an underlying intersex condition, they become very nervous about whether or not we should go forward with gender confirming interventions or not. And in part because it disrupts their notion of the natural, right? Like what do we think might be, if we're going to say that what we think is these folks are born in the wrong body, but they really are something, right? Like they really are boys and girls' bodies. Once we kind of raise the question of, is it a girl's body? They are a C, right? Just like, I don't know what to do here now. And so this is a one way of saying that I think you're right, that it's important to track how essentialism or essentialist understandings work here, but also it's important, or I think it's reasonable to expect that we're not going to see logic necessarily. But one thing that is quite interesting, and so I will say for myself, or the way that I'm kind of, my own approach is to say, I am actually completely agnostic. I want to say that like what gender is, and we can all agree, some sort of result of nature culture. I'm agnostic about what it is. That's fine. To me, the issue about not assigning sex or gender to intersex infants isn't actually about what we think their real gender or their true gender is or isn't, and whether or not we think we can identify it, but just granting that we think in general, one sex or gendered future is something that they are the authority with regards to. So one part that's actually not here, and one argument that's kind of later on in the book, is I introduce something that goes beyond autonomy to talk about authority. And here, authority captures for me not just the capacity to make the decision. So like, I am the one who does the informed consent. And again, like, we can get into debates about how do we think about autonomy and the critique of liberal notions of it. But I want to grant there's something here about not merely being the one to make the decision, but who do we think is epistemologically the expert, right? And like, the idea is that with regards to my sex, like, what is the best sexed or gendered future for me? I am the expert. And that is something we seem to grant completely in trans care, right? Like, that's what we're doing, is saying, and that's what the whole kind of gambit is placed upon, is like, I'm the one who says, I have dysphoria such that I need intervention. And they're like, you're right. Right. And so this notion is, I defer to your account here, but that's not what we're doing in the other place. And so to me, actually, it's important and interesting to think about how the natural arguments about the natural and the socially constructed are circulating here, because I think they are serving, or one of their functions is to obfuscate the moral claims. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Since we don't have an open question right now from the audience, I'd like to, oh, here's one. I'll pause my moderator privilege I was going to take.
Sure.
Ray Briggs asks, is there something to be learned from comparing intersex activism with autism activism? Both have this difference between parent/clinician perspectives and patient perspectives, but it seems like autism activism has had much more success with amplifying patient perspectives over the other two.
Yes, thank you so much for that question, Ray. You're pointing to something that I have been thinking about actually for a long time, but haven't written on myself, because I do think there are very clear parallels that you can see between the autism movement and the intersex movement, in terms of seeing like this bifurcation with regards to parent run or parent clinician perspectives, and that often parent and clinician perspectives are working within this highly medicalized model, and they're often arguing for more research, more resources, more funding, but all aimed towards normalization. And then you see a patient perspective on the other side that is critiquing the medical model, is arguing against normalization, and is providing this kind of normal variation account. And so I do think, I think you're quite right here. And I think it's interesting to think about, why has autism activism had so much more success? I do think that there are a few things I would point to here. I do think, for example, some kind of like political missteps were taken in terms of what we might have imagined the disorders of sex development treatment model could have done. Right. There were some, for example, who strategically endorsed it because they did think that, if we start working with doctors and get them on our side, and we're all at the same table, then we're going to be able to get more traction here. And I don't really think that cashed out. But I think there's a lot of, I also think another issue has to do with the very intimate nature of the things that we're talking about, right? That there are folks, for example, who are very willing and interested in being involved in intersex activism behind the scenes, but are maybe not ready to be public in the same way that has been possible for a lot of folks in the autism community. But I do think there's so much we could learn there. And so I really appreciate you bringing those things into conversation.
Thank you. We have just one more moment, I think, and I'd like to at least read out Kristen's question. And of course, Kristen, congratulates you on your brilliant ideas and the early morning laugh, fascinating talk. Deshaun Harrison's recent book unpacks several incidents of racialized police brutality in terms of body size. Younger, fat Black boys are considered much older, but also more threatening, he suggests, because of their size, or at least that this cannot be understood without reference to size. This is not the same for normative whiteness. So do draw on size in how cis white futures are secured. And if you could just note that we're running very close to time as you answer this, that would be wonderful.
Yes, thank you. I will just say very quickly, I have not. I really appreciate this comment because that has not been something that is like explicitly been there or is in there in the text right now, but is definitely in the background of my thinking. And so I really appreciate you pointing to someone here who might help me bring those things together. It's great.
Thank you. And I just want to thank you again, Catherine, and thank you so much to Shelley Tremaine for organizing this conference, which as always is wonderful. And thank you to our organizers, Joe Wolf and Support Jamie and others in the background who are supporting. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much, Melinda and Catherine. Thank you again for fantastic talk and discussion, as Shelley has put in the chat. So we'll be back at 5 minutes past the hour for the next presentation, and I just ask the presenters to go through the backstage portal so we can prepare ourselves for the next talk. So thank you, and see you back just in a little under 10 minutes. Thank you very much.